Harold Green had always considered himself a practical man. At 72, his days had settled into a quiet rhythm. Breakfast by the window, a slow walk through the garden, the occasional crossword puzzle that reminded him of the sharpness he still carried from his engineering days. But beneath this calm, Harold lived with small, persistent burdens, the kind that come not all at once, but gradually over the years, until they feel like just another part of aging. The discomfort after meals, the dull pain in his joints, the restless nights. He had accepted them all with the same quiet resignation he applied to his thinning hair and slower steps. That was until a conversation with his granddaughter changed everything. "Grandpa," she said one evening, pulling a small box from the kitchen shelf, "do you know this can actually help your stomach?" Harold squinted. "Baking soda?" She nodded, smiling. "It's not just for cookies." That night, with skepticism and a teaspoon, Harold took his first sip. Warm water, a dash of powder, a quiet act of curiosity. What followed, however, was nothing short of a revelation. 1. Relieving the fire within, heartburn and acid reflux. For as long as he could remember, Harold had made peace with discomfort. He wasn't the kind of man to complain, especially not about something as common as heartburn. But deep down, it was more than a nuisance. It was a quiet thief, stealing his comfort, his sleep, and the joy of a good meal. Every evening, like clockwork, the burning sensation would rise behind his chest. It wasn't sharp, but it was persistent, a slow, smoldering pressure that turned dinner into a gamble. Would tonight be fine? Or would he be sitting up in bed again, heart pounding, throat burning, hoping it would pass? Doctors had a name for it: acid reflux. Harold just called it that feeling again. He had tried all sorts of pills over the years, antacids, tablets, even prescriptions. They helped sometimes, but often the relief came too late or not at all. He had started to avoid his favorite meals. He learned which chairs let him sleep upright. He stopped drinking coffee. Even tomato soup, a lifelong comfort, had been pushed aside. But then came something surprisingly simple. It happened during a conversation with his old neighbor, Frank, a man who, at nearly 80, still had a knack for old-fashioned wisdom. "You ever tried baking soda and water?" Frank had asked one evening. Harold was skeptical, but he figured he had nothing to lose. That night, after a familiar flare-up, he stirred half a teaspoon of baking soda into a glass of water and took a sip. And just like that, calm, a warmth spread through his chest, not the burning kind, but something closer to peace. The fire eased. His breath deepened. He slept. You see, baking soda, plain old sodium bicarbonate, is naturally alkaline. When it enters the acidic environment of the stomach, it quietly goes to work. It neutralizes excess acid, turning it into harmless salt, water, and a little bit of gas. No more flame. No more fight. From that day on, Harold kept a box of baking soda on the kitchen shelf. Not just for baking, but for breathing easier after dinner. He didn't throw out his medications, but he no longer feared mealtime. He no longer hesitated before bed. He had found relief, simple, humble, and earned. Because sometimes the best solutions don't come in a bottle. Sometimes they come from listening, trying, and remembering that life doesn't have to be uncomfortable just because you're getting older. 2. Wasn't that just part of getting older? When his ankles puffed up a little, he figured it was the long hours standing in his garden. When he felt more tired than usual, he told himself it was because he wasn't getting his usual 8 hours. And that creeping blood pressure? Well, his doctor had mentioned it, but Harold thought he was managing it just fine. What he didn't know, what so many people his age never realize until it's far along, was that his kidneys were quietly crying out for help. Those two small organs, tucked away and rarely thought about, were fighting an uphill battle. Every day, they filtered Harold's blood, trying to clear out waste and balance the delicate chemistry inside his body. But over time, with age and pressure mounting, they'd started to struggle. And Harold, like many others, didn't hear their whispers. It wasn't until a routine checkup that his doctor brought up something unexpected: baking soda. Not for cooking, not for cleaning, but for his kidneys. Harold raised an eyebrow. "Baking soda?" he asked, skeptical but listening. His doctor explained that under careful guidance, studies have shown that a simple, safe dose of baking soda may help neutralize excess acid in the blood, one of the silent burdens that tired kidneys often face. This doesn't cure kidney disease. It doesn't turn back time, but it may slow the progression, giving the kidneys a bit of relief, a bit more time to do their job. And for Harold, that meant something bigger than just medical terms. It meant more mornings waking up next to his wife, more afternoons tending to the soil, coaxing tomatoes and marigolds from the earth, more evenings with his favorite book, or walks at sunset where he held her hand like he always had, gently, quietly, with love. It wasn't a miracle, but it was a lifeline, a quiet, simple way to give his body a chance to keep going, keep doing the things that mattered. And for Harold, that was everything. 3. A gentle warrior, easing urinary tract discomfort. Harold had always been a quiet man, never one to complain. He handled most things in life with a steady hand and a patient heart. But there was one thing he found hard to talk about, even to those closest to him. It started subtly, a little discomfort. His doctor told him it was nothing unusual, a mild urinary tract irritation, something quite common in older men. But common didn't mean easy. It didn't make the burning any less uncomfortable. It didn't stop the anxiety he felt every time he went out, worried he might need a restroom urgently. It wore him down, not just physically, but mentally too. It was a quiet struggle, the kind that's hard to explain. Then, through a neighbor's suggestion and a bit of research, he tried something simple, sipping water mixed with a bit of baking soda a few times a week. It felt too plain to make a difference. But over time, something changed. The burning eased. The urgency became less frequent. It wasn't a cure, but it brought him something he hadn't felt in a while: relief. The baking soda, his doctor later explained, helped balance the pH in his urine, making it harder for bacteria to thrive. To Harold, though, it didn't matter so much how it worked, just that it did. It gave him back a sense of control, a little peace in his day. He no longer had to plan his walks around the nearest restroom. He started to feel like himself again. Sometimes, the most powerful remedies aren't loud or dramatic. They come gently, like a quiet warrior standing by your side, steady, reliable. It struck not with warning, but with a sudden, merciless cruelty. Gout. It had followed him like a shadow into his later years. A few times a year, often in the quiet of the night, it would pounce. He would wake up to a stabbing, fiery pain in his big toe, the kind that robbed him of sleep and left him staring at the ceiling, gritting his teeth. Even a soft touch of a bedsheet felt like knives against his skin. The next few days would be torture. He couldn't wear shoes. Sometimes, even slippers were unbearable. He shuffled across the floor, gripping the furniture for balance. Getting to the bathroom was an ordeal. Going outside? Forget it. The doctors had given him pills. They helped a little, but the pain always returned. Each time, it felt a little worse, a little longer, more difficult to bounce back. Harold tried to accept it as part of aging. Just something I have to live with, he would mutter. But deep down, the thought of the next attack always lingered. He began to dread bedtime. Then, almost by accident, came something different. A conversation with an old neighbor, someone who had fought gout for years, led him to try something unusual. Nothing fancy, just a small glass of water with a pinch of baking soda, once a day. Harold wasn't expecting much, but a few weeks in, he noticed something, subtle at first. The flare-ups came less often, and when they did come, they were weaker, shorter. He wasn't limping for a week. He could sleep again. He read later that baking soda might help the body dissolve uric acid before it builds into crystals, those sharp little intruders that trigger gout pain. It made sense. A simple drink, working silently in the background, like a tiny shield against a cruel enemy. Harold wasn't cured, but he was no longer helpless. The beast hadn't vanished, but he had learned to tame it. 5. Restoring dignity, mouth sores, and bad breath. Harold never expected that getting older would feel this way. He had always been a proud man, neat, clean, respectful of how he presented himself. But aging, as he came to learn, had a quiet way of chipping away at that pride. Not all at once, but slowly, subtly. It started with the dentures. They fit fine at first, but after a while, they left a sore spot underneath his upper plate, just enough to make eating uncomfortable and smiling a little hesitant. Then came the dry mouth. At first, it was only in the evenings, but soon, it lingered throughout the day. It made speaking harder, chewing more tiring, and worst of all, it brought with it a fear Harold never imagined he'd have: bad breath. He became more withdrawn. Conversations with neighbors were shorter. When his grandchildren visited, he kissed them on the head instead of the cheek. He even found himself turning away slightly when talking to his wife of 45 years, wondering if she noticed something he couldn't fix. Harold tried everything. Every mouthwash on the shelf. Brightly colored bottles with bold promises. But the alcohol burned his mouth so badly it felt like punishment. The milder ones? They tasted like mini water and did nothing. It was frustrating, embarrassing, lonely. Then, one afternoon, he remembered something his mother used to do. A simple remedy from decades ago. Baking soda. He went to the kitchen. Half a teaspoon in a glass of warm water. He swished gently, not expecting much. But to his surprise, it didn't sting. It didn't taste awful. It just felt clean, gentle, soothing. That night, something small, so simple, had given him back a part of himself he thought he'd lost. It wasn't just about breath. It was about dignity, confidence, comfort, things that matter even more as we grow older. 6. The movement after movement, post-exercise soreness. Harold never fancied himself an athlete. The idea of running marathons or lifting weights at the gym, that belonged to another time, or maybe to someone else entirely. But he valued movement. It was his quiet rebellion against aging. A slow stroll around the neighborhood each morning. A bit of gardening in the backyard, trimming roses and pulling weeds with care. A few simple stretches before bed, just enough to loosen his joints. He did what he could. It wasn't about chasing youth. It was about keeping the life he had. But the next morning, that was the price he paid. It started with a stiffness in his legs. A quiet soreness that crept in slowly but stayed longer than it should. His shoulders would ache from pruning. His back would protest from bending over too long. Sometimes, even his hands felt like they belonged to someone 20 years older. It wasn't unbearable, but it made the simple things harder. Slower, less enjoyable. He accepted it for a while. After all, wasn't this just part of getting older? But then one evening, after a long conversation with a friend who had dealt with similar problems, Harold tried something new. Just a little baking soda, stirred into a glass of water after his usual evening activities. He didn't expect much, but the next morning, something was different. The tightness in his muscles was less. The soreness didn't hang over him like a shadow. He didn't wake up dreading the first steps out of bed. It was subtle, but real. Day after day, the change held steady. The baking soda seemed to help his body handle the lactic acid that used to build up, the culprit behind those stubborn aches. He didn't feel like a young man again. He wasn't trying to, but he felt more like himself. The version of Harold that could enjoy his walks, trim his bushes, and stretch before sleep without worrying about paying for it the next day. And that freedom? That was everything. 7. Balancing the inner world, the body's pH. For most of his life, Harold had been a strong man, not just physically, but steady in spirit. He had built a life brick by brick, raised a family, weathered storms. But as he moved into his later years, something began to feel off. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just little things. A stiffness in the mornings that lingered longer than it used to. A heaviness in his legs after short walks. His hands, once quick and steady, sometimes ached when he tried to write his morning notes. Even his mood, though he didn't say it aloud, felt dimmed, like a room with the curtains drawn. Harold assumed it was just age, but there was more to the story. Over the years, modern food, processed meals, pain medications, and even stress had quietly tipped the chemistry inside his body. His internal environment had become more acidic, a silent imbalance that affected his cells, his joints, even the strength of his bones. There were no sirens, no warnings, just a gradual drift. And then, almost by chance, Harold tried something simple, an alkaline drink. No bold promises, No flashy labels, just a gentle blend designed to support the body's natural balance. At first, he didn't expect much, but within weeks, Harold noticed a change. He felt a little lighter. The mornings didn't feel quite so heavy. The aches didn't speak so loudly. He smiled more, not because anything grand had happened, but because he felt more himself. He didn't chase trends. Never had. He wasn't looking for a miracle, just a way to feel a bit more alive, a bit more connected to the body that had carried him through decades. And in that quiet shift, that simple return to balance, Harold rediscovered something precious. Ease, comfort, clarity. It wasn't about turning back time. It was about honoring it and giving his body the support it quietly needed to keep going strong. From powder to peace. Today, Harold keeps a small glass jar by his kitchen sink. It's not flashy. It doesn't promise instant transformation, but it represents something powerful. A choice to care, to listen to his body, to choose gentleness over complexity. He still checks with his doctor before using it regularly. He still knows it's not a cure-all. But for Harold Green, that humble powder has become a symbol of something far greater than health. It's a symbol of hope, of wisdom, and of the truth that aging doesn't mean giving up. It means adapting with grace. If this story spoke to you, take a moment to reflect. Could something simple make a difference in your life too? Sometimes, all it takes is a spoon, a sip, and the courage to care.